There is some that has 2 Academy Awards sitting on a shelf somewhere. He has been called one of the greatest actors of his generation. He has been photographed in war zones, disaster zones, and on red carpets beside some of the most famous women in the world. And then, in the summer of 2020, while the world was locked down and holding its breath, Sean Penn quietly married a young Australian woman that most people had never heard of. No grand ceremony, no celebrity guests, no magazine spread, just the legal proceeding conducted over video call, a pandemic as the backdrop, and a 31-year age gap that raised more than a few eyebrows. Who was she? Why did one of Hollywood's most complicated and celebrated figures choose someone so far outside his usual orbit? And when the marriage ended, what became of the woman at the center of it all? That is the story we are telling today. To understand why this marriage captured public attention, you first have to understand exactly who Sean Penn is in the landscape of American cinema. Penn rose to prominence in 1982 with Fast Times at Ridgemont High, playing a sun-drenched surfer named Jeff Spicoli, a role so effortless and so memorable that it could have defined a lesser actor for life. It did not define Sean Penn. It merely introduced him. What followed was a career built on intensity and commitment. Dead Man Walking, Mystic River, Milk. He won back-to-back Academy Awards for Best Actor in 2004 and 2009, a distinction that placed him in extraordinarily rare company. Directors sought him out. Critics took him seriously. Audiences were sometimes unsettled by him, which was exactly the point. But Penn's name also carried weight off screen, and not always in flattering ways. His volatile temper had been well documented since the 1980s. His brief and turbulent marriage to Madonna became one of the defining celebrity spectacles of that decade. A later marriage to Robin Wright lasted over a decade and produced 2 children, but it too ended in divorce after years of on and off reconciliation attempts. Penn had also spent considerable time doing humanitarian work, most visibly in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. He was someone who seemed constitutionally unable to stay still, either professionally or personally. By the time he reached his late 50s, he carried the kind of reputation that makes people curious about what comes next. What came next was Leila George. Leila George was born in 1992 in Australia. She came from a creative household, the entertainment world. Greta, Skaki, and actor Fint Kent. Wayne's Wanda. She was not entirely a stranger to the entertainment world, but she was operating on a vastly different scale than Sean Penn. Her acting credits were modest. Her public profile was nearly non-existent by Hollywood standards. The two reportedly began seeing each other around 2016. Penn was 55, George was 23. The age alone made the relationship a topic of conversation, but those who observed them together in those early years described the dynamic as genuine and grounded. There was something about the pairing that confounded the usual celebrity logic. Penn had always attracted attention, had always moved through the world with a kind of charged energy that made neutral spaces difficult to occupy. George, by contrast, was quiet, private. Australian in the warmest sense of the word, meaning she seemed unbothered by spectacle and uninterested in performing her personal life for public consumption. For a man who had spent 4 decades under a particularly unforgiving spotlight, that quality may have been more than appealing, it may have been essential. When the relationship became public knowledge, the response was predictable in its contours and occasionally unkind in its tone. The age gap dominated the conversation. Headlines leaned into the math of it, calculating years rather than considering the people involved. American tabloids framed Leila George primarily in relation to Penn rather than as an individual. The phrase, mystery woman, appeared with numbing regularity. In Australia, where Penn had a strong but somewhat distant cultural presence, the reaction was a mixture of curiosity and mild national pride, the slightly bemused acknowledgement that one of their own had landed in an unusual orbit. Some commentators questioned the wisdom of the pairing, particularly given Penn's history with previous relationships. Others pointed to the sincerity that seemed evident in their appearances together and chose to extend the benefit of the doubt. What the coverage rarely managed to do was treat Leila George as a formed person with her own history and perspective. That erasure, the reduction of a woman to her proximity to a famous-owned quiet understory. By 2020, the world had changed in ways nobody anticipated. COVID-19 had halted nearly everything, including the ordinary rhythms of courtship, ceremony, and celebration. Sean Penn and Leila George married in July of that year. The wedding, if it can be called that in any traditional sense, was conducted via video call. It was a civil ceremony, stripped of the theatrics that normally accompany celebrity unions. No venue, no guest list, no photographs released to the press. There was something quietly meaningful about that, regardless of how the story eventually ended. In a culture that monetizes intimacy and turns private milestones into content, they chose to simply get married. Alone, during a pandemic. Over a screen, Penn spoke about George in interviews during this period with evident warmth. He described her as someone who brought a kind of equilibrium into his life. She was, by several accounts, a steadying presence in a world that had never been particularly steady for him. They lived largely out of the public eye. There were no children from this marriage. Their life together, at least as observed from the outside, was genuinely private in a way that few celebrity marriages managed to be. The marriage lasted approximately 14 months. In October 2021, Leila George filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The filing was reported widely, though. Neither party made extensive public statements about the reasons behind the separation. What was confirmed was that the marriage had ended, and that it had ended relatively quickly. Speculation about the causes circulated in the usual channels. The age gap was revisited. Penn's demanding career and his continued involvement in international humanitarian work, most recently in Ukraine following the Russian invasion in 2022, were noted as factors that made conventional domestic life complicated. None of these explanations were confirmed by either party, and it would be irresponsible to treat them as anything more than inference. What is clear is that two people who appeared to genuinely care for one another found themselves unable to marriage work over the long term. That is not a story unique to celebrity, it is simply a human one. Leila George has largely returned to a private life since the divorce was finalized, has readden out of the spot, which feels consistent with the version of herself she presented throughout the relationship. She has not made high-profile public appearances, the marriage, or its solution. She has continued to pursue her creative work quietly, without the kind of media management apparatus that typically surrounds figures who have passed through the orbit of major celebrity. She lives largely on her own terms, which, given how little control she seemed to have over how she was discussed and perceived during the height of the relationship, may itself be a form of reclamation. Sean Penn, for his part, has continued working. He completed a documentary in Ukraine, returned to acting, and has given interviews in which he reflects on his life with the kind of candor and occasional abrasiveness that has always characterized him. He has not spoken extensively about the marriage to George in the years since divorce. Two people, one unusual chapter, a quiet ending. There is something in this story that resists the easy narrative of celebrity romance gone wrong. It is not a cautionary tale, it is not a triumph, it is something more ordinary than either of those frames, which is perhaps the point. Sean Penn spent decades being one of the most watched, most analyzed, and most debated figures in American popular culture. He chose, at least for a time, someone who wanted none of that. Whether that choice elected, wishful thinking is not something any of us can deter from the outside. What we can say is that a young Australian woman stepped briefly into one of the most glaring spotlights in the world, carried herself with dignity throughout, and then stepped back out of it with her privacy largely intact. That is not nothing. In the current media environment, it is actually quite difficult. The real questions this story leaves behind are ones worth sitting with. Can two people from fundamentally different worlds build something lasting when the weight of one world is as heavy as global separity? And at what point does the search for ordinary life become the most radical thing a famous person? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.